My name is Theo Sitter. I'm a consultant and a senior fellow with the Alliance for Peacebuilding. And we are, we've been on a roll, and I'm actually starting to lose count the number of events Wednesday afternoon, at least afternoon on the East Coast, I think, events that we've been hosting. I think this is our 9th event in our spring and summer series on peace building right here in the United States. So preventing and reducing conflict and instability in the US, shaping what comes next. And this series is hosted with the US Peace, Justice, and Democracy Working Group, which is co-chaired by Urban Rural Action, and Joe Bubman is with us today, and with the Alliance for Peacebuilding. So our panelists, I am just super excited for our panelists today. Peacebuilding in practice, perspectives from community members taking action across divides. And this is a question that I think is on all of our minds, is how do we have conversations, and how do we have conversations that are transformative in our society with people that we don't agree with people who are across divides. So I am excited to hear from our panelists from across the US today, and give us some really good perspective on that. Joe, I'm gonna let you take it away. Joe Bubman is with Urban Rural Action, and he's gonna be moderating our panel.
Thanks, Theo. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited for this discussion, so thanks for being with us. As Theo said, I'm the Executive Director of Urban Rural Action and thrilled to be a co-host of the US Working Group on Peace, Justice, and Democracy. And I'm excited for this session on peace building in practice. I'll say a word about the program, and then I'll introduce our panel, and then we'll jump right in. This was a program that featured 33 Americans across the country living in different types of communities with different political views from different racial identities and ethnic backgrounds and different faith traditions, who came together on Zoom over 7 months during the pandemic and across the election season to do 4 things: build relationships across divides, explore different perspectives on issues, strengthen collaboration skills, and then do some type of work together, take action on a range of different issues. And so the 33 community members were divided into 5 different teams. And those teams were economy, food waste, race, education, and media. And over these 7 months, this team, this group of 33 Americans, and you can see that Stephanie just placed into the chat a summary of the program. And we'll see in a second maybe a word cloud that features how people describe themselves, and people describe themselves in all sorts of different ways. And so it was really phenomenal to see this group come together across difference to explore different views, strengthen collaboration skills, build some new relationships, and take action together. This was a program that was implemented by the News Literacy Project and 3 AFP members, UR Action, WCAPS, Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, and Bridge People. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel, who I'm very grateful for spending time with us today outside of the DC bubble to share their perspectives on their experience. These are 4 people who I've come to know, like, and respect over the past year. I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to work with them. They're people who are very busy in their personal and professional lives, and yet they committed themselves to this experience over 7 months. Shenée Simon in Memphis, Tennessee, thanks for being with us. Brian Rubin in Bowie, Maryland, thanks for being with us. Michele Jansen in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, thanks for being with us. And Kristy Plaza in Los Angeles, where I'm located as well. Thanks for being with us. So with that, I'm gonna jump right in, and please do, for all the attendees who are with us, thanks for being with us, and please do type into the chat your questions, your comments, and I will weave those into the discussion. So the first question is, what attracted you to this Uniting for Action America program in the first place? Why do you think this type of a program is important for our country at this time? So why don't we'll go maybe the first person who unmuted herself, Kristy, and then maybe we'll go clockwise around the screen. So Kristy, do you want to go first?
Sure thing, Joe, thanks. And I'm super excited to be here and so happy to be able to share my perspective and my experience with all of you. So thank you all for joining us. So what attracted me to this program was actually through my organization. So I am also a communications and media manager at the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future. So basically that means we're an institute of politics. And, you know, after the George Floyd protests and everything that happened last May, it was so important to take action. That's something that's always been incredibly important to me, to take action and to speak up and to especially look at the intersectionalities of like gender, race, politics, etc. But when that happened, I knew that as an organization, we had a responsibility. And so my whole team decided to develop this action plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there was a lot that we wanted to be inclusive of because there's so much that does divide us and that does identify us. And so my supervisor, Kami Akavad, found this program and pitched it to the team. And we just thought, you know, it was wonderful. And we were excited to do the work because at the center, we're nonpartisan. We want to make sure that we bring people from all sides of the aisle. But this was one of the ways in which we, the staff, can be having those conversations, not just our speakers, but to model what we are sharing with our students, with our audiences, expecting of our speakers, and just putting in the work and taking action, like I said before. And so that's why I think this type of program is so necessary, because it was twofold, right? It was about making those connections, humanizing the other, you know, trying to find common ground, but also doing something important and tangible. Which is, I think, a huge thing that we heard, you know, from all people, all communities, that as much as it's important to talk about things, we need to be taking action and doing something. So that's what I loved. It was this hybrid of both of them.
Thanks so much, Kristy. Brian, what about you? What attracted you to the program? Why do you think it's important for our country right now?
Yeah, certainly, like Kristy, I'm excited to be here and share with everyone. And it's funny, even though I am 15 miles north of Washington, D.C., in Bowie, Maryland, I was really growing tired of looking to Washington to solve societal's problems. The approach in Washington is just far too partisan, and it overlooks everyday people. And I really felt like the only way to respond is to become organized as citizens. And I think change really happens from the grassroots level. And to make that happen, I needed to be in conversation with other citizens, get to know each other, bring our collective ideas together in a way that I think gives some solutions that I think Washington's not providing for us. Even some of our other larger institutions aren't providing for us. It is a way for citizens to come together and take ownership of a country that is supposed to be designed in a way for citizens to make a decision and to have a say about what goes on in our country.
Thanks so much, Brian. Michele, what about you? What attracted you to the program?
Well, you were the one that let me know about it. You contacted me because we had met through Better Angels initially, a workshop that was being done in our area. And through that process, I had certainly expressed to you my desire for discussions and dialogue, even with people who I might very much disagree with on certain politics or certain ideas. And I felt it was really important. You had invited me to be part of another project with your other group, the Urban Rural Action, and we did a gun safety issue there. So you had contacted me and expressed that this was going to happen with these different topics. And I love the idea of being, again, a part of a group where people can come together from different viewpoints, because I think what especially always attracts me and has and did to this group is the fact that we're getting so bad at talking to each other when we have different perspectives. We talk past each other. We tend to get into our camps and hunker down there and kind of depersonalize, dehumanize, you know, people with other opinions. And I want to break that cycle. I want to be able to talk to people who have different opinions, find where we can find common ground. Again, not necessarily to change each other's mind on all these things, but knowing that we're all human, we have a human experience, a universal experience that we can tap into. And even if we don't see the problems as the same, I think it doesn't stop us from being able to work together and make things better. So I was very excited to be a part of this. And, you know, especially in the race issue, which is really difficult. Part of me didn't want to be in that group just because I knew it would be one of the more difficult ones. But that's precisely why I did end up wanting to be in that group, was because why not challenge yourself with the most difficult one?
Thanks, Michele. We'll certainly dig into that experience a bit more. Shenée, what about you? What attracted you to the program, and why do you think this type of initiative is important for our country?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to share space with everyone today. I learned about the opportunity through WCAPS, the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, which was an amazing experience. I was an inaugural fellow as well in 2020. And what attracted me to this program was the application. Like, it was not just about theory. It just wasn't about kind of what was happening to me in my silo and my experience, but it was an opportunity to come together and actually begin to applying kind of some of this theory, some of my own personal experiences with other people. And I think, as everyone has highlighted today so far, in terms of how important communication is, and I think giving the complexity of issues and complexity of our country, that the only way that we're going to be able to increase awareness, we're going to be able to begin to mobilize and to create change, is just through conversation. And this experience really allowed for more intimate kind of one-on-one conversation, being in a party of, you know, a group of 33, but then having it broken down to smaller groups. It was just an opportunity for intimacy, of really being able to be transparent and to build real relationships on a smaller scale. And so that was really attractive to me about the program, and just just combining experiences and then being able to apply and to work collectively on something together.
Thanks, Shenée. I've heard a few themes come up already from this group about interest in the program. Number one, the importance of engaging across divides, right? Diversity is a source of strength in our country, and being able to build connections and interact with people who maybe look different from you or come from a different type of community. Second was this idea of taking action and not waiting for others to solve problems for us, but being able to do something on our own to overcome challenges facing us. And then a third piece, which many of you touched on, was the ability to communicate effectively across difference with people who hold different views. And I appreciate that that was a motivating force for many of you. And that is a nice segue to my targeted set of questions. And again, we'll scan questions that come in from all of you who are tuning in this afternoon and this morning. Brian, you were part of a 5-person economy team, right? Because these 5 teams were working on issues framed broadly. And on the economy team, you ended up partnering with the Education Design Lab, which works on sort of the future of work. And your team had ideological viewpoints from across the spectrum. And I recall an interesting debate early on about resource hoarding and whether that was problematic or not, and who is a resource hoarder and what does that mean. But I'm curious, from your experience and the process of engaging with team members across different ideological views, what did you learn from that? What did you take away from the program based on that experience?
Right. It's interesting because I set up in my earlier comments how it's dependent on people. But at the same time, I realized we as people are flawed in certain ways, to be quite honest. And we sometimes are reluctant to see other people's point of view. We prefer to defend our own point of view. And we saw that happening in my group. And a lot of it depends on someone's lot in life. Many people are very satisfied to sort of live out and reinforce their perspectives and not really look to others to gain from their own life experiences. And we got really stalemated because folks are really focused on understanding the issue from their life perspective. And it's really hard because we all have different lots in life. We all come at it from a different angle. And it made it very difficult. In fact, we got stalemated. Most of the group, you talked about the resource hoarding, really wanted to go in that direction. But there was one voice that said, no, I don't believe this is true, and really sort of stopped our momentum, where we had to really deal with that for a moment. And you talked about going to the Education Design Lab, which was not our intention from the start. We sort of modified our work in that way. But sometimes in trying to accomplish something, you do have to make some modifications along the way. And I think that was one way where we were able to make some progress. I don't know if we were able to get the one person that didn't see it from that perspective to change his viewpoints. And maybe that was part of it. I always go back and forth on whether or not that was a good thing. It's the one piece that I had that bittersweet. Like I was happy that we progressed, but I was unhappy that we couldn't get that person to maybe open up and see another point of view.
Mm-hmm. Brian, I want to ask a follow-up, and then we'll go to Shenée. And I see a question, a great question in the chat about facilitators. And indeed, this program was designed so that every group had both a sort of moderator / facilitator, as well as an advisor who could support the team as they implemented their projects. There was a little bit of a transition where the facilitator was there to help with the conversation that Brian has just described, exploring different perspectives, trying to demonstrate understanding of different views, analyzing the problem, whether it's food waste, whether it's racial injustice, from different perspectives, and then begin to design a project. And from there, the group was sort of on their own to implement. Brian, you mentioned the sort of stalemate that resulted. People often dig in their heels and they become convinced that their view is maybe the only view or the right view, and others' views that they disagree with are wrong. Is there any advice based on your experience for overcoming that type of a stalemate in conversations across ideological divides?
I don't know if there's an ultimate solution, but I think we have to be mindful about speaking our truth and speaking from our perspectives in a very generous way, in a way that is seeking to understand and seeking to explain to others. And that's the best you can do. And I think sometimes you will be successful, but there are moments that you won't. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do things with a spirit of generosity. And I think it's important to do that. And sometimes we come to a point where even that generous spirit won't work, and you got to move on. And that's just the way it is.
I think that's really powerful, Brian, because there's a norm of reciprocity, right? The more people feel heard by you, the more likely they are to hear you. As you say, there's no guarantee, and maybe they're not interested in collaborating and engaging and hearing your view, but they are more likely if you take that lead and you have that spirit of generosity and you try to listen and demonstrate understanding. Shenée, let's hear a little bit about your experience. You were on a group that was focused on food waste. And part of your group's purpose was to raise awareness about this problem. 30 to 40% of food in this country is wasted. It's very problematic, given that a lot of households are struggling to get food on the table. You all implemented a small project and you helped organize a panel discussion on food security and food justice. It was quite powerful and insightful. What do you think you and your team focused on food waste accomplished during this process?
Great question. And I wanted to add something just to Brian's, if you don't mind, if I just kind of sidestep, and I will include it back into this conversation. But Brian, I really love what you said about generosity. And I think another word to go with that is just grace, of showing grace to who is sharing and who's not sharing, and being mindful of kind of who is, when to step up and when to step back, depending on what's happening. I know that we talked a lot about in this conversation about differences, but I think it's also equally as powerful when people are speaking the same language or understand the same, that you have that baseline, because even though you may be the same, it's being able to build on that sameness, right? I think, yes, there's differences, and yes, we bring those up, but I think it's also important to find out, what do we have that are the same? Like, what are our same values? And so when I look at our food group, I think we all had the same feelings or thought about food waste. So this is a huge problem, but had no idea of how to tackle it. And so I think while we weren't kind of trying to convince or hear about our differences, we're really trying to figure out, but we all think the same thing, but what now? So even though we all kind of had similar perspectives, I don't know that it gave us any more power or momentum to be able to move forward. And so in our conversations, I think we're trying to look for those points of difference sometimes to say, well, I know we think the same on this, but what's kind of maybe where do we think a little bit differently, or we need to add more clarity, or maybe that's the point of conversation to identify what's different. And so I think by having the panel discussion was effective because it offered many differing perspectives that we didn't have within a group, but it allowed us to bring different perspectives to the table. And I think one piece that really resonated with us when we were talking about food, just in semantics, like food waste, and who does that speak to? Who is that audience? And I think we began to find that was a very socioeconomic difference about who considered waste. That became like a class, that if you were a part of a middle upper class, waste meant one thing to you. And I think when you're talking about different communities that maybe are lower socioeconomic, waste is kind of like, I don't think that even comes in the conversation, because it's like they're using every bit of what they have to have food, right? And so through that conversation of food waste, we were exploring food waste, food justice, food insecurity, food apartheid, food councils. I mean, it ended up being this whole myriad, and I think we just merely scratched the surface. But I think for us, a big piece of it was just kind of definitions. Like, what do these words mean? Who do these words have meaning for? That they have a different sentiment from an urban community, from a rural community. There's a difference. I mean, just being in Memphis and this mid-South, that knowing like, what does that mean to be this mid-Southern region? It meant something very different in this space of the country than it did, for one of my peers in California. And so I felt like the panel was great because it allowed for different perspectives to share, and just different definitions, from the gleaning to like food rescue to, I mean, it was like this whole world. And I think it became a whole world opened up for all of us, even though I think we all had some understanding of food. But in terms of kind of what it truly meant, I feel like we really explored that in terms of how do you apply these terms, these theories, these methodologies and practices across different geographic spaces, political spaces, and even socioeconomic spaces.
Thanks so much, Shenée. I love that point about even if you are working with team members who have similar views, that's an opportunity to engage with a broader collection of people who maybe have different views and who can challenge you or inform your thinking. And I like the idea too of being really conscious about not just how you define a term, but how other people you might be communicating with define it, and how they're going to react to the language that we use. We'll probably come back to the language we use in this conversation. This is a nice transition point to the race team. Michele, you mentioned this earlier. So both you and Kristy were members of a racially and ideologically mixed group. And this team, the issue was framed broadly as race because we wanted to create space for people with different perspectives on the experiences relating to race in our country, how they show up, how different people view them, different people experience them, and the lived experience of people of color in this country as well. And so this, of course, was challenging, as Michele, you alluded to. But I wonder if we could just start with, from your perspective, Kristy, your perspective, Michele, maybe we'll start with you, Kristy. What were you trying to achieve? What was challenging about talking about race? What didn't work? And at what point did you feel like, oh, we're making some progress? What enabled that?
Yeah, so those are all very loaded questions because of the experiences we had. Michele and I get it. So there was such a huge challenge to talk about race because right when we started, we all agreed racism is bad, but that's not the real challenge. That was not what we were trying to accomplish. It was about how do we talk about race? How do we actually take action? And we found that, like Shenée mentioned, like Brian mentioned, the terminology, our agreement on like what means what, we were not on the same page. And we spent a lot of time talking about it. And I'll be very honest. So my answer kind of encompasses all of the three questions, but there were times where we didn't come to a point of agreement, and we really couldn't understand the other person's, point of view, because there were some of us who had a certain view, some of us who, had a similar view, but maybe not, that complex or that deep, and they learned something, but they still didn't know enough. And then others who had a different view. But when you talk about terminology, when you talk about race, a lot of it has to do with lived experiences, with theory, with sociology, psychology. It's so interconnected with all types of sciences when we talk about sociology and psychology, but also, other identities, gender, sexuality, and your lived experiences are really inform, what your perspective is. And since we didn't have this common ground, we spent a lot of time looking for it. And that's what I think what was so great, because we disagreed, but always respectfully, I will say that. Thanks to our wonderful moderator and advisor, there were times where we were just all talking and we couldn't get to this place of like understanding, but because of our facilitator and our advisor, we were able to take a step back, remember the great communication skills we learned through the program, which I know we'll be talking about later, and really utilize those communication skills to remember why we were there and what our goal was. It wasn't to convince anybody that we were right and they were wrong. It was to find that common ground. And through the practice of it, because yes, it takes practice. You have such deep disagreements for something that you personally identify with. It's very difficult to take, a more objective view to it. And so it took time for all of us, but we did do it through just the practice and conversation and remembering or reminding ourselves also that we were all people and we were all there with the same goal. We were all committed to it. No matter how hard it was, we knew why we were there and why it was important. And so we did find that common ground. And we never really agreed on the terminology, but that's okay, because that wasn't the point. The point is that we learned about the other terminology. I myself learned, more about critical race theory and why someone might not agree with it versus me who does agree with it. So it was about understanding these different perspectives and how, ironically, our lived experiences informs us all. Sometimes we come to different conclusions because the eye of our lived experiences is different. And so to go back to your first question, what were we trying to achieve? It was finding this common ground and understanding that we were not there to change anybody's mind, not actively, more like we're trying to show why we have our perspectives, why our lived experiences are valid, and why they do factor in. They're not separate of the issue, and we're all coming to the table with something that needs to be heard and recognized if we are to take action, which did lead to our actual project. But I'm not sure if you wanted me to talk about that just yet.
Sure, that's great, Kristy. Why don't we bring in Michele, and then I'd like to ask a follow-up question relating to terminology, which you've highlighted was a challenge, at least in the context of trying to agree on it. Michele, what about from your perspective? What was the experience like for you? What were you trying to achieve? What was challenging and what worked?
Well, one thing, and I know you and I talked about this when you first contacted me, and at this point, it's funny, I realized moving through it, and then now even after the project, how much I didn't understand. And when we talk about the definitions, my goodness, I think if I brought up that word definition one more time, the group was like ready to, I don't know, because I kept saying, I think we're not saying the same thing. I think we're defining something differently. And then we realized it really was hard to figure out those definitions from a purely common ground, because I think what I had talked to you initially about was I knew enough about critical race theory, and even that definition, I find it differs from group to group. But I was worried that there'd be someone so invested in that, because I do understand that part of the solution critical race theory wants to, or thinks should be a part of this, is that certain majority voices need to be put in the background and minority voices put in the foreground. And I understand, I know enough about it, and certainly have read and learned enough and talked to people who totally believe this. I get the concept, but I was worried going in, and I expressed this to you, that because I am one of those voices that the theory says should be put in the background a little bit, even though I was the minority viewpoint, which I was brought in because I am more conservative, and it turns out I was the only conservative in the group, there was a tension there because I was the minority viewpoint. But especially one person in the group was very invested in theory. She kind of expressed, you're used to your voice being heard. And I think it made her, honestly, my own opinion, she wasn't listening to me from my different viewpoint as much, because she's so invested in the idea that people with privilege maybe shouldn't speak as much, if that makes sense. And she expressed that a couple times, actually. And I don't think she meant to be ungenerous. I think it's just truly how she feels about that. And I didn't grasp that at first. And as we moved along, I did. And it made me get less, at first I felt annoyed or I felt unheard. And then I thought, you know what? I'm reading more, I'm understanding more, she's telling me more. I'm not getting offended by that, because I'm trying to understand her perspective and where she's coming from, although sometimes it was a little hard. And so that was challenging. And I knew it would be going in if someone was that invested. But, you know, I think over time we did hear each other better. I'm not sure, though, because this person did express at the end that she didn't think this was the best kind of group for her to work in, particularly. She said she couldn't work with people who had different values at the end. And she also said it didn't matter because as long as you have critical mass, that doesn't matter. Now, I was sad that she ended on that note, because I don't think that was the point at all. It's not about overwhelming people with your point of view so that they can't have a point of view anymore. I mean, and I'm sure, I mean, your own mission says that's not what this is about. So I was a little sad that from her point of view, but that's obviously just her point of view and the way that she sees things. And but I think we did make some real accomplishments, and where I really give Kristy and the whole group the credit is they did hear me when I said, we need more dialogue, because you all are coming more from a university setting. You're closer to a university setting where that kind of ideology is more accepted and more, and I'm coming from outside that world, or trying to present a view from outside that world. And that even though you all feel like, no, we've had enough dialogue, we heard that from a couple people, I'm tired of talking, but I kept trying to remind people, no, but you're coming to a lot of people who've not been exposed to this even at all yet. Some, I've really learned mostly about it in the last year and a half. So I kept trying to remind people, and I, of course, from my own point of view, have to remind myself of that as well. We all get in our bubbles and we have to be careful, but I was the minority point of view. And I think when we start hearing each other that way, that's what really helped us to finally find a way we could find our common ground. And that's where we ended up with our mosaic, because we understood we're not going to find exactly the same way to do what we want to do, because we are coming from such different perspectives that we need to educate each other more and present many options for people with different point of view to be able to engage. And that was the true blessing and breakthrough, I think, that we came to. And I was so excited about that.
Yeah, thanks, Michele. And that does underscore one of the underlying principles of this work, is that even if we can't reach quote unquote common ground or agreement on the ideas or the theory, that doesn't mean that we can't still do something together that addresses some aspect, even if it's small, of a challenge. And through that collaboration, we can build relationships, we can increase our understanding of different viewpoints, and also lay the groundwork for doing something potentially bigger over time. I do want to come back to the terminology piece. As you both said, Michele and Kristy, you weren't able to reach agreement on the terminology. You used the word privilege, Michele. We've also talked about critical race theory. There were other terms like systemic racism and equity that came up over the course of your conversations. And so this is a question for the group. What are the benefits and drawbacks of really focusing on aligning on terminology? Because I can imagine that it can be quite helpful if you're all working from a shared vocabulary. That way it sort of lessens the miscommunication that might occur. On the other hand, you might spend so much time trying to define terms when people are going to have their different views on those terms, and you might lose out on an opportunity to go deeper, or to explore actions that you might take, or just to accept that people are going to have different definitions. So this is open to anyone. How do you view, in conversations like this, how do you view how worthwhile it is to really focus on defining terms and agreeing on a shared set of definitions?
So happy to jump in. So I think it's worthwhile to at least spend some time talking about terminology in the effort to minimize the potential miscommunication, because we definitely don't want to, be in the middle of a conversation. Maybe you end up screaming at each other and you're like, wait, hold a second. Well, hold up, I actually meant this. And you're like, well, we just spent 15 plus minutes yelling at each other. So that's why, in an effort to not have that happen, although I'm sure nobody's yelling at each other when you're having these conversations, that you spend some time talking about terminology, but not with the goal of like finding a common definition, because that's one of the drawbacks. You might not. Something that I think is important about terminology, and the reason why I say terminology, not definition, is because these terms that we use, they're not understood as just purely their definition, right? You can look up systemic racism and you'll have what Wikipedia says, what Merriam-Webster says, what a sociologist says, so on and so forth. And that definition will always change. And not only that, but you have this wide public audience reading it all and then putting their own connotation, right? Their own lived experience. And so you'll probably never get to a point where it's 100% the same. So, but what you can accomplish by having this terminology, you know, discussion while you're talking about these tough conversations is at least a somewhat starting ground, like a general understanding of where somebody's coming from, what's informing their perspective, their opinion, you know, and you can kind of build from there. Because I also think that when you're talking about terminology, you learn a lot about a person. Because when Michele and I and the group had conversation about terminology, always came to like a personal experience. And I learned something about Michele's personal life. And when I shared about my own, I shared something about my personal life. And so that's another good benefit. You actually learn more about the person and it humanizes them in your eyes. So that's a long answer to say that it's important to talk about terminology, not just because of, you know, you're getting this common ground or this common understanding, because you learn about someone. But at a certain point, you do have to continue on the conversation, because if not, you will just get stuck there. There's just such deep disagreements that at a certain point, it's not agree to disagree. It's all right. We understand that. Now let's move on with our conversation, which is something that did happen in the Grace group many times.
And I think it's also degree. Sometimes we would say, okay, here's sort of a common framework that we on that term, but you think it exists to this degree and I think it exists to this degree. And sometimes that was just, again, learning about each other and how we saw it did make for better understanding and did help us to relate then, even if we didn't completely agree on what it was. And so once we found that common framework and then talked about how we thought it existed to whichever degree, realizing we weren't going to agree on that completely, that was helpful. And then we could move on, you know, after we did that. So totally agree. It did help us, I think, as long as we could keep it pretty, you know, respectable and sane, which I think we did most of the time. Sometimes it got a little heated to a point where we had to come back. And then when we came back, we would say to each other, listen, I didn't mean, you know, to let that get this way. This is how I was feeling. And you share with me how you're feeling. But again, it was that kind of framework and then to what degree. And I think that's where we ended up on a lot of those terms.
I want to open it up to Brian and Shenée. I'll just quickly say that you've both shared some insights that I maybe hadn't thought much about when I posed this question, which is that even if you're not agreeing on the definition, you can humanize each other or learn about someone else's humanity, as Kristy, you said, because you're sharing experiences about why people define or view a term in a certain way. But also, as you say, Michele, it wasn't necessarily to agree on the definition, but to maybe have a better understanding of why you and other people in the group view that word, that term in different ways, which is beneficial. Brian, you were going to jump in?
Yeah, and I'm okay with wrestling with terms, but when it gets a little bit scary to me is when it muddies the water of both historical and empirical facts. And when people sort of have these terms, but then they use the terms to sort of muddy the waters of things that are really true or really happened. And we have to really be careful about that, because, all right, if we can't lean on the terms, can we lean on the history? Can we lean on the facts? What can we lean on that establishes truth? And I know everyone has a different viewpoint and a different way they come to truth, but where can we find something that we can land on? And I just want to raise that, so we're really careful about history and data and true things when we do that. And I know we wrestle with that a little bit around the news and how we analyze the news as well. But I do think there is ways that we have to be careful when our terminology becomes a debate, but then we use it to erase things that actually are true.
Is there an example, before we go to Shenée, is there an example, Brian, that comes to mind where you've experienced sort of the muddying of the water?
Yeah. You know, unfortunately, it sort of lands on critical race theory. Many that would oppose critical race theory also want to take the history books and rate slavery to be something different than it was. And I know sometimes people get bunched together and everybody doesn't fall into that category, but there's some truths about our country, about our nation, and I think we ought to be honest about whether or not we can come to agreeable terms and the solution to deal with it. But we have to be honest about what actually took place in this country and how this country was built.
Thanks, Brian. Shenée, go ahead.
Yes, Brian, a lot of things that you said that I agree with. I think when we're talking about peace building in the U.S., that is very key. That's very key, because some things that happened in the U.S. did not happen in other parts of the world, and just making sure that you have that context of that. To your point also, Brian, in terms of having definitions or terms, I don't think terms should be there to kind of be like it's either this or that, but I think it's always good to have some context, and having that context, and then to be able to say, well, based upon this context, Kristy, how does this resonate with you? Brian, how does this resonate with you? To what your point is, Michele, about variation. I think, yes, there's variation, but I think there are some things that are very either this or that, and then there's some like, okay, there's some ambiguity. But I agree with you, Brian, in terms of and maybe it's not the terminology, but maybe it's the values. I think the values is kind of what trumps it in terms of how do you value this term? What does this term mean for you? When we talk about terminology, I think terminology gives just a baseline. I think it gives some margin, right? So that we know that, hey, if we're speaking too far left or far right, we may need to bring it in a little bit because this is what's resonating for us. This is what's resonating for this time. I think also terms can also be kind of time bound to what's happening. I think it's important when we talk about, now being June, being Pride Month, that I think terminology is key to explore that when we're talking and working with others, to be able to fully understand someone's perspective, someone's experiences, and just someone's existence. That's really humanizing someone by identifying some terms. I feel like there's some travesty sometimes when we're not talking about terms, because I think when you're not using some terms, it does perpetuate some divisiveness. It does perpetuate some erasure. It does also brings about some invisibility. So I think terms can be helpful and useful, but I think also anchoring them into values.
Thanks all for sharing your views on terminology. Very interesting. I want to sort of pivot a little bit to the overall approach of the program, because there are a couple of questions that relate to this. And just to be clear, again, for those who are joining and maybe aren't familiar with Uniting for Action America, the early gatherings in this program were really about understanding different perspectives and exploring different views, and they weren't about reaching common ground, right? Because as Brian, you talked about, there were very different views on the challenges relating to the economy and the solutions. And as Michele and Kristy have talked about, there were lots of different views on race, and it was about exploring and understanding those views and different lived experiences with race, not about sort of finding common ground and compromising between different principles. At a certain point, there was an effort to reach agreement on actions to take, but that didn't require reaching agreement on philosophy or ideology. Brian, your group, for example, on the economy, decided, even though you had very different views on, again, problems, solutions, you all were behind a small project to support people without four-year college degrees, to work with community colleges to become engines of economic growth, to help people without four-year college degrees get high-quality jobs. And that was the collaboration with the Education Design Lab. So there is a question from Daniel, who was one of the participants in our program alongside you all. So it's great, Daniel, that you're with us. And I'll sort of paraphrase, which is, at the end of the day, you weren't really changing policy. Shenée, you led a brilliant panel discussion on food waste and food justice, and you raised awareness about this issue, but it didn't translate into a state or federal policy change on food production or food rescue or food waste or food injustice and so on. And of course, Brian, you weren't working at the policy level to maybe create more opportunities or funding for community colleges. So how do you feel about sort of the outcomes that were reached when it was largely building relationships, largely understanding different perspectives, maybe strengthening communication skills, but not necessarily policy change?
Brian, okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, Joe, I think for us, it was really important just to get the information out there, right? I know that a question that I was asked early on in the beginning of this process for another panel that you invited me to was kind of, you know, is food divisive? And one of my responses was, I don't think we talk about food enough for it to be divisive. And so I think people not having enough conversations about food, then how can you begin to build transformation, policy change, et cetera? So for us, it was just having this baseline conversation about food. It was defining some terms. It was getting, you know, exploring the narratives of people that were kind of living this, you know, putting together, you know, food places of resources to pick up food, kitchens, you know, gleaning, you know, all these types of things, like kind of learning more about that. So it was more like exploratory and learning. And I think something with that, what we did in kind of this whole process is it's a journey, right? This is a marathon, not a race. That we're not saying in the 7 months, like you got to solve world hunger, in 7 months you don't have to do this, but it's just this journey to begin to unpack, explore, talk about, and kind of figure out kind of, okay, well, we did this piece, you know, and now this has equipped me to do something else. So did policy and legislation changes come from our group directly? No, but I do believe and hope that at least 1 or 2 people left that panel discussion and will engage in their community in some way. That some folks said, hey, you know what, after learning about this, I don't know that my area has a food council. I want to start a food council. Or, hey, these have been going on in my city for a while. I haven't been participating. Maybe I should go participate so I can begin helping and figure out, well, where does policy play a role in this? And so I think there's indirect kind of, or long term. I look at a wheel, spokes in a wheel. I believe a lot of work that we did was kind of the center of that wheel, and just to know that we are putting out these spokes and that it will go forth right into the environment within people that participate in the food group, for those that were able to watch the panel discussion or will watch in the future. So I believe that will become a manifestation of the panel, but it didn't come as a direct, like that wasn't our intent. And I think we felt kind of inept to do that in the beginning, because we too were still learning these terms, right? In terms of what does this all mean? And I mean, in terms of these waste numbers, that is such a huge percentage of what really can 5 people do in 7 months to really accomplish that. Not a lot to bring that number down, right? And to know that it's much bigger than, you know, cutting back. It's much bigger than just doing smart shopping. Like it's, you know, it takes these multiple behaviors, multiple actions for multiple people to do them for it to make an impact, but more so just to bring about awareness and hopefully to empower folks to go forward and to be a part of the change.
Thanks, Shenée. Yeah. Brian, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. One of my commitments into my own life's work is to stir people's imagination, both morally and civically. And policy is not always imaginative, right? Sometimes we have policies that has no imagination. And the best way I think that we do, and I do think we had opportunities to do this, to stir the imagination is through disruption and exposure. And I think if you were exposed and you were open to receiving, or you were disrupted and didn't find it as an inconvenience to be disrupted, but really took inventory of yourself, in a way, I think it was a good thing. But the reality is we can only sort of examine ourselves, right? We can only be Socratic with this. I don't know if some of my other participants or group members did any self-examination, but that's not for me to judge. My goal is to at least put forth my ideas in a way that might stir someone's imagination, and we have to leave it there. But I do believe that so many things just get cut off at the legs because we lack the courage and the imagination to think of a better world. We base so much things on how things already are as opposed to what they could be. And I think our conversation let us do that. So if we change policy, cool. If not, but I want an imaginative policy, not just policy change. I guess really what I'm trying to say in response to that question.
Yeah, and we were pretty explicit in this program that we weren't aiming for advocacy. We weren't trying to affect policy change because we knew that we were bringing together people across the ideological spectrum. And it's a bit unrealistic in a program like this to agree on changing federal or state policy when you have such a diversity of viewpoints at the table. What is possible, though, is to connect with people, to build relationships, to do something small scale. So if you came to this program determined to fix income inequality in our country, this was not a program where you were going to achieve your goal. But if you wanted to better understand how people see that as a problem or don't see that as a problem, and what the different viewpoints on causes and solutions are, then this was an experience that you might find fulfilling. Michele, I want to go to you next. You mentioned earlier that in your race group, you were the lone conservative voice. And you're speaking to an audience right now at the Alliance for Peacebuilding that generally leans left politically. And there are many liberals who I encounter and work with who are often eager to engage with conservatives more and wanting to engage across divides and maybe struggle to do that. And so I'm curious, based on your experience holding sort of right of center views and engaging with progressives in this, in at least your project team, what would be your advice for progressives who want to engage across divides for the purpose of building relationships and better understanding different perspectives?
I think, for one thing, don't make assumptions that, I mean, I think there was a couple of times when people said, well, you haven't lived this experience. It's like, don't make that assumption just based on the fact that I'm in a certain demographic that I wouldn't have lived that experience, because I think that's a problem we can all have when we make assumptions about a group. I remember I ended a little bit of a heated exchange where I said to somebody, I am not a group, I am an individual, you know, and because I just wanted to remind them that there's certain boundaries and certain experiences that you can see sort of belong to one demographic versus another, but don't always assume that because someone's part of a demographic, they've never experienced certain things. Because I had one experience in my life that I won't go into. I did share it with the facilitator of the group. It was quite a racially aggressive experience where I feared for my life. And you might not think that would happen to me living in, you know, rural Pennsylvania, but I was during medical school and I was someplace different, and I broke some unknown rule to myself and was perceived as the other in that situation and put into a terrible situation that I can relate. Now, maybe it hasn't happened to me as frequently and in different ways that other people experience such things. So I'm not going to make any judgment about that, but it was, you know, I think there's an assumption I've never experienced anything like that because of my demographic. So I think and that's a good rule for all of us, but be careful about assumptions. I'd say be careful about this new ideology. To me, it's new. To many people in society, it's new, kind of sweeping the country. Don't let it become orthodoxy. Be willing to let people question. You know, don't cut them off at the knees just because they question something. Be willing to have that debate and dialogue and persuade rather than, I hate when I see someone shut up because they're censored or they're, oh, you can't have that point of view, or you are this kind of a bad person. No, we need more dialogue. We need to persuade people to hear why they think something might not be right, and then tell them why you think it is, rather than, and one thing that bothers me, and maybe again, it's because it's a certain perspective, but this idea that, well, I don't need to explain to you. Like, here I am in this group that supposedly doesn't understand, but then we say, well, you don't have any right to ask that person to explain that to you. When we're in a group like we are, that's kind of the purpose of it. And I don't think people in this group do understand that. So I guess be careful of some of the orthodoxical, or what's the word I'm trying to find, some of the verboten things that might be part of that ideology when you're trying to come together to hear a different perspective. Maybe let go of that a little bit, because if you don't, I'm afraid it'll cut off the conversation. As much as you might think it's right for an application, you know, if you believe there's a certain kind of privilege or a certain kind of way that we need to deal with this as a society, maybe let that go a little bit in these kind of smaller conversations so that you don't miss hearing each other or missing an opportunity to help someone else understand, if that makes sense.
Shenée, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I just want to add to that too. I think in terms of that is understanding also that for certain groups that are in these certain identities or in these spaces, that some of this work is labor. It's emotional labor. And I think sometimes that is forgotten, and just to be able to recognize that and to know that some of those discussion points are going to be they're going to be laborious for some folks, so they're working through it. Or to your point, you're saying, Michele, like, hey, no, keep talking. And sometimes it's too much for someone to keep talking about it, right? I think also just to keep that in mind in terms of the labor that's happening. I think also keeping in mind that there's some trauma sometimes that is connected to some of this work that we're talking about. Also, I think keeping in mind too that just being empathetic, and I think to what we talked about earlier on, Brian, not just being generous, but also being gracious, right? Because everybody is coming from a different point and a different perspective, and just being mindful of that and knowing that even though this may be, I really need to understand this for me to be able to move forward, but to know that also like it may not be a group member's responsibility to educate you. It may not be that group member's responsibility to give you an answer. And sometimes we got to look beyond that group to get answers, or just kind of our approach of how we're asking for information. And so I think that's really important that yes, these groups are supposed to be relationship building, but I think also the group should do that, but also there's some work outside of the group time that should be taking place in terms of reading, experiencing, having conversations with people outside of in your circle of influence of saying, hey, you know, I had this experience, let me bounce this off of you. What do you think? Or who else can I ask to get more information? So I think really, you know, leaning on the group to have this meaningful experience and conversation, but knowing also through that there's some self-work, and to your point too, Brian, about just, you know, self-analysis. Everyone may not have that, but I think everyone has some process of having those moments of reflection, and, you know, we can't speed someone along in that, you know, but I think just being aware of all of that, you know, in terms of where people are, not only ideologically, but even emotionally where people are when in this space.
Listening to you talk, Shenée, maybe we'll go to Kristy in a moment, reminds me of those communication principles that we agreed on at the start of the program. And you talked about being gracious. We also talked about, and you talked about emotional labor and maybe the trauma that might be experienced by people of color talking about race who don't have those same lived experiences. We talked early on about, to the extent that you have been negatively impacted by what someone else has said, sharing the impact on you so that they can better understand. And also if you have unwittingly caused harm to someone else, to be open to exploring why that was harmful, even though that wasn't your intent. And that's easier said than done. And I do welcome any views on how you implement that in practice. I think that was hard in the program. Kristy, were you going to jump in with a thought? Go ahead.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank you so much, Shenée, for saying that. I mean, you weren't even in the group, but I was like, yep, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That's 100% correct. And in the interest of being transparent, I'm Michele already know, or we talked about this in the group, but I myself felt that emotional labor. There were many times after many meetings, I needed to like take a break. I needed to just turn off my brain, and as much of a privilege as that is, and just not think about it. And then after, self-reflect, because I think that's incredibly important, because there's so much, you know, trauma in my own life, and talking about it and being open and understanding, sometimes it's hurtful to yourself, and it's not, I don't think anybody ever means it that way. Like Michele, I know you never meant it that way, but it's just hearing it, right? And having to give that some empathy when you have that trauma. There was no empathy in that situation. So it's incredibly difficult. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, Shenée, because that's something that I think happens a lot in every single one of these conversations. And there needs to be that empathy, that consideration when you enter these conversations. But that's what also brings it up for future conversations. Like maybe you do take that break. Maybe you do have that self-reflection time. Maybe you are able to find the words and to share it later, or to share, you know, a key takeaway later. But something else I really wanted to bring up was something that everybody said that I think is important, particularly in the race group that I saw, was dialogue, right? Dialogue implies two or more than two people talking, and it's equal. Or there's equity in the conversation. And many times when we're having these conversations, especially within our, you know, race group, we really had to think about physically, or like time-wise, who is talking the most, and are we making space and time for everybody to talk? Because it's important that we understand each other, of course, and we have these relationship building, you know, conversations. But it's also important to make sure to elevate other voices, especially if they're not being heard, because even if they might share a similar viewpoint to somebody else in the group, their own experience is unique and completely their own, and they're only going to add to the conversation. So that's why, you know, I really love how everybody's bringing up this concept of dialogue. And here I am talking about terminology we've already talked about, but it is important because, you know, even Michele kind of brought it up before, there was certain group members who, you know, felt a certain way at the end of it. And what's so interesting is, to me, what I got from it at the end was that their perspective on the program wasn't, you know, different than ours, or wasn't that the program wasn't helpful or useful or didn't accomplish what it was supposed to accomplish, but that there was this incredible self-reflection of, this is not the work that I want to be putting all my emotional effort into. Because that's the thing when you're having these conversations, it's a range of where you are willing to put in the effort and the work. And, you know, all of us here we wanted to start at basically the starting point of like having these dialogues. But some people with the emotional work, they want to put it into taking more actionable items, on having already that baseline. And particularly in the race group, we didn't have that baseline. So I do understand where that difference of perspective comes from, but the importance of taking these conversations and figuring out what you want to do after, and making sure that every voice has a space and a literal time. Like, they have to have literal space and time, and we're elevating the right voices, but they need to all be heard. It wouldn't be a conversation without it.
Yeah, that's really powerful, Kristy. I do want to explore this point a bit further, particularly on race. I also note that there was sort of a question relating to agree to disagree, which explicitly in our program, we said we're not going to agree to disagree, because a lot of the learning comes from the disagreement and the exploration of different perspectives. You've hit on something important, Kristy, around dialogue and what does that mean? What we were trying to achieve, at least from my perspective in a conversation on race, was both elevating the voices of those most impacted, which is good practice in conversations on race, because people are impacted in different ways depending on the color of their skin, but also create space for different perspectives, including perspectives that might not be that popular when it comes to issues like critical race theory or systemic racism. And our hope was that you could achieve both of those principles, which might seem like their intention. And I'm just curious, and anyone can answer this, because we've all had conversations on race, and I wonder, is it feasible to try to achieve both of those objectives and have both of those as principles, or not, based on your experience?
Well, that's what I experienced a difficulty with, I believe. And I sort of said it before, but just to repeat, I think there was an assumption about me being in the privileged position in some people's minds, that some of what I said wasn't taken as seriously. Like, one time I shared something that my daughter was experiencing from a professor that was very invested in critical race theory, and put it into every aspect of the class, to the point where I honestly feel she wasn't being sensitive to how somebody in the majority was perceiving it. It became almost racially abusive, in my opinion, because it was a constant drumbeat of, you know, white privilege and inherent racism, and it was so one-sided from this professor that I believed, my daughter certainly, she felt beaten down by it. She felt sort of demoralized by it. And when she tried to express a different position, not an opposite position, but brought up any questioning of what this professor was saying, this professor's point of view was, no, I'm not going to accept any other positions, which I find quite startling and shocking in a university setting. Because I think in a university setting, we should be open. That's where you should be having the maximum amount of dialogue and different positions and ways to learn about these things. So, and I was describing it, and my daughter is getting depressed, and one person's point of view at the end of it was to dismiss it as discomfort. Well, how dare you talk about your daughter's discomfort when others are suffering a lot more? That was that was laborious for me. That was tough for me to talk about my daughter, and I was expressing emotional difficulty over that. But I think because this person was locked into the concept of, you know, again, elevating certain voices, pushing back on certain voices, they just weren't hearing me as the individual, describing my individual daughter. And to me, it wasn't anything about my race or privilege or her race or her privilege. It was the fact she was feeling demoralized because of the way the professor was talking about one group being in a very negative way. And it's not just discomfort at that point. That's true pain. Like I said, my daughter's actually getting somewhat depressed. She didn't want to go to that class because it was just so negative all the time. And maybe that's just that particular professor shouldn't be presenting that stuff in such a negative way. I think there's better ways to do it. But to be dismissed that easily was very hard to hear and upsetting. So, that can be, I think, a danger when we look at something from a perspective and ideology, looking at a group rather than hearing an individual and what they might be expressing.
And there are a couple comments in the chat that I think are consistent with what you're sharing, Michele, which is one, this idea that Colette has shared of a humble posture of learning and being open to others' lived experience and unique experiences, and what Kevin has shared, a good book resource, and seeing people as individuals, not just as members of a larger identity group. I want to open it up to Shenée, Kristy, Brian, any perspectives you want to share on this question?
Yeah, I mean, as I listened to Michele talk, I sort of was wrestling with this sort of interplay between systems and people, and sometimes we conflate them so much that we get really caught up and there's some systems that I really would like to sort of combat, but I still can't do it in a way that denies someone else their human dignity. And it's hard, and I think sometimes we get caught up in it, and I don't even have complete words on how to articulate it right now, but I'm hearing this interplay. Like sometimes there's some systems that really anger us, and we're really passionate about it, but we can't get to the point that we deny another human their humanity, regardless of how they think differently than us or think like us. And we're not very good at that in our dialogue. And we love to talk about, and it's funny because we love to lean on systems when it benefits us. But we don't share the same desire to affirm humanity when it doesn't benefit our argument too. And like I said, I'm still wrestling through that thought, but I sort of wanted to raise that tension between both system and individual.
Brian, what resonates for me when you say that, what comes to mind for me is I think it's just westernized thinking and westernized philosophy. Like I really appreciate, yes, we're having this conversation about peace building in the US, and I really appreciate that the audience members are all not from the US. And so I think that that's also another value in terms of when we're looking at beyond race, but looking just at culture and ethnicity, because I think that sometimes when we think about religion too, because I think all of these pieces add more just a different perspective. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is very westernized thinking, this whole concept of Western privilege, right? And just kind of our philosophies in these systems are very westernized. And I think really incorporating these more Eastern philosophies that really do put human dignity at the forefront, that really put peace at the forefront, that really put empathy at the forefront. These are things that we as Westerns are just not innate. And these are things, this is what we need to learn. And so I really appreciate that there are some folks that are not, in the US are like, hey, can I still be a part of this? Or what can I add to the conversation? Because I think that perspective is often missing when we talk about peace building, when we talk about relationship building. This is coming from a very Western philosophy. And how do we move beyond that, where these different cultures are centering the person, not the problem, not the practice, not the ideology.
I would love to build on that, because Shenée, I was thinking about that too, about our Western approach. And I agree with everything you said about, peace building and thinking about, empathy and grace, to say something that you said before. But the other part I was thinking about was community focused, right? When, I'm Mexican American, so in my culture, it's all about family and community. And I know that is throughout many other, global cultures and countries that we view it that way. America is very unique and we think very individual. But one reason why I focus so much on community, I'm thinking about community right now, and what, comes to mind is when we're thinking about the community and what's best for all of us, we do inherently think about the individual, right? Like, how are we going to help our community if we're not focusing on being empathetic and considerate and with grace to the people in which we are surrounding ourselves with? So that's why, you know, for me, I love this focus on thinking about and, you know, prioritizing the community, because the individual is an inherent part of it, right? And we just start to, like, dialogue is inherently built within community, because you can't accomplish anything as a community without working together, building together, having these conversations. And so I love this perspective of, you know, coming together in that way, and us always focusing on the goal and what's bringing us together. And it also, you know, Brian, I know you're trying to get your words across, and I feel that, you know, dilemma of like systemic and individual, but that also kind of plays into my perspective for community, where I'm like, yeah, systemic things are built because of communities and society. So if we're so focused on the community, we are already building it up to so that systemically it is more reflective of, you know, group values and principles and ideologies that are based on consideration and empathy and race.
Well, one thing that I remember that when we had a nice breakthrough was because again, trying to figure out systemic and what does that mean exactly, was the conversation we had on the car, you know, whether you're in the Model T or you're in the race car. And I liked that perspective, because you'll hear so many people say, well, it's not about the individual acts of racism, it's about the systems. And I liked that analogy of the car that you're in. Now, I don't always agree that the cars are so divided by race, and that's where I have a difference maybe of opinion, but I like that framework. I think it's an understandable framework you can wrap your mind around. So that was a nice moment when we were able to say, okay, if that's what we're talking about, that makes sense. You know, if you're talking about the system and how it affects the individual or the group as they're moving forward, I liked that. And I like when you can find ways to get a concept across that people can understand. But I also want to say, you know, we talk about Western values. Western values have a lot of empathy too, and a lot of value in family too. It's different maybe from Eastern philosophies in some ways. And I'm kind of versed in both because I have family that comes from Eastern philosophy and have gotten to know about that a lot through my family. But you know, don't be too absolute about those things not existing in Western society, because I think they do. And obviously we all in all different cultures have our more community-based or empathy-based aspects, and then aspects of it that's not so much. But I understand what you're saying. I mean, I think, and I appreciate, Brian, what you said about trying to find that balance, because I don't, and what's always hard, I always have to come back to, I don't disagree with the concepts. I might disagree with the absoluteness sometimes of the way it's described, but I do know that those things exist, and I do myself struggle with that balance between, you know, listening, hearing the other person, not trying to be too self-focused, trying to make sure I'm having understanding. It's very tough, these things. And I think, you know, the fact that we're all here and talking to each other shows that we all really want to find that way to do it, even if we struggle.
Amen to that. And I also want to acknowledge a range of thoughtful comments that have come in the chat. So feel free in our last bit of time together to weave in any responses that you'd like to some of the questions and comments in the chat. I do want to sort of remind you all of the different activities you participated in as part of this program. Kristy, you mentioned earlier the communication framework, which we call the ABCs: ask questions to better understand their view, break down your view so they can understand your perspective, and check your understanding of different perspectives. And we use that approach throughout these conversations so that we could achieve a mutual understanding of different views. You contributed to and signed off on a public statement. And Stephanie, perhaps you can drop that link into the chat, because that was quite impressive, right? Despite all of these different views, you were still able to achieve an agreement on some principles that you held in high regard that you wanted to share with the public. There it is in the chat. You analyzed the issue, whether it was the economy, whether it was race, whether it was food waste, in a systemic way, mapping out causes and effects of the problem. You designed a small scale project and you carried it out. You participated in a ceremony on Veterans Day that Shenée co-led. Shenée is part of a military family, and discuss the importance of engaging the military community when we are designing and implementing interventions. Michele, you mentioned the car metaphor earlier, and that I think was first discussed during a session on reforming criminal justice from the left and the right. There was another special event on detecting misinformation and another one on uniting for action on climate from the left and the right. So my question is, what aspect of this program was most meaningful or valuable to you?
I'll go first, Joe. It definitely was. And the funny thing is, I don't think I was aware of it when we dealt with ABCs for constructive conversation. You sort of just thought you were learning something and you didn't quite know how you were going to apply it. I actually wish my group might have spent more time around some constructive conversation. There is this desire for us to always go into do mode and not just be and sort of figure out and assess. And we always want to fix something. And I do want to fix things, but I know it takes time and we might need to spend more time. I mean, there's this whole adage, you know, if I had so many hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend more time sharpening my axe versus just chopping away. And we're all chopping away with these dull axes, and I think we need to get a little bit better sharpening our axes. And I think the ABCs for constructive conversation help us do that.
And just to follow on that, Ryan, thanks for that. I love it. Just being, I think is really key. And I think along with the ABCs, I really think looking at like effective communication in terms of communication strategy, of kind of looking at, you know, your groups to being in groups 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and who do you really spend your time really focusing on, like those 3s, and how do you really make sure that you're able to bring those 3s to a 2, and also just being at peace of knowing that the 4s and 5s, you may not change their mind, right? And that's okay. I think we made an analogy in a workshop not long ago about giving you fare for the bus, to say, hey, I'm giving you these coins for the bus, but you may not choose to get on the bus at this stop, or maybe the next stop you might get back on, but it may not be my bus. But to look at that in terms of like we're planting seeds and to really be effective of kind of how to be in communication with these groups and really coming up with strategy. And then to answer your question in terms of what I appreciated the most, I think I appreciated most the monthly accountability of having these meetings every month and having to be accountable to make time, not for myself, but also to make time for others. Because as much as it was about sharing with other people, but it was also time for me. It was also time for me to explore kind of how I communicate, what I'm communicating, you know, what's on my plate, what am I focusing on, what am I working on? And please pardon this noise in the background. My 3-year-old has found me, so I'm going to wrap it up. But I think the accountability is what I look forward to the most, the monthly accountability.
Thanks, Shenée. Go ahead, Kristy.
Yeah, so for me, I hear Shenée say accountability, and it brings up to mind like this one word, and it's being active, being present. And by what that I mean is that I was actively, you know, a part of this program, and I was pushing myself and challenging myself to be vulnerable, because I think that's important, to self-reflect, to listen to others, to make that effort to find common ground, to check in every month and make sure I did my work. I, you know, listened to different points of views. I made sure that my own were, you know, being reflective of everything that was needed. And not only that, but when you come to the communication part of it, active listening is so incredibly important. The ABCs were a really great technique for active listening, right? And being able to put it into practice, you know, month after month was wonderful. And the psychological benefits of being able to do this program and complete it and like have these connections and have this community and impact other communities and other individuals out there was just such an incredible experience. But not only that, in a personal way, I was just really proud of myself and the team, like the whole 33 participants, and of course everybody at URA for, you know, doing it, completing it, and modeling this not only for ourselves, but our loved ones in our community and our organizations, because we are reflective of them too.
Thanks, Kristy. Michele, any thoughts from you that you want to share on this?
I've mostly expressed, I think, a lot of what I could say, so I won't repeat myself. But I do want to add that this has really helped me to engage in other groups that I'm also working with. There's a local community group, similar, with different points of view, different races, and we're trying to have this discussion. And we're doing it through text, which is really interesting. We're finally at the place now where people are vaccinated and they want to get together. And so hopefully we'll do some face-to-face, which I think will improve the conversation, because text is really hard. I mean, Zooming is hard enough, and being able to see each other. When you're just doing it through words, it's always a little fraught with danger. And we've certainly gotten into some battles where we've come back and said, wait, I didn't mean that. But we keep coming back. And I think that was a great point that Kristy made. To stick through it, stick with it to the agreed upon endpoint. Keep listening, even when you get upset. Like, I know I'm seeing a comment about why my daughter felt the way she did. And I don't agree that that's why she felt the way she did, but that's okay, because I understand where that perspective is coming from. And getting that understanding of why someone has that point of view is really almost equally critical to getting someone to completely agree with you. Because if you can understand where the person's coming from, then we can find ways to maybe try to persuade each other. If I don't agree with that, maybe I can find a way to persuade that person why I don't agree with that. Or maybe they can find a better way to explain to me that I agree then. And we have to keep reminding ourselves that if we allow disagreement and honing of our reasons for what we believe, that's where we find the better solution. So that's hugely why I appreciate this group.
Thanks, Michele. We have one final question for you all, which is, this session was called Peacebuilding in Practice. And let's say we define peacebuilding as efforts to address the underlying causes of conflict in our country to prevent organized violence. Different definitions, but sort of working with that. Do you think this was a peacebuilding program? Why or why not? Go ahead, Kristy, if you...
Okay. Brian, are you going to talk?
No, go ahead.
I got it. I really appreciate this question, because I was actually just grappling with it in another mindful leadership workshop I was recently a part of. And we talked about this concept of peace. And for me, peace isn't like the absence of violence or, disagreement. It's about this community intention, this individual intention to work towards something that is going to help us all. And it's going to be reflective of the goals that we want to see of more of diversity, equity, and inclusion, of, the beauty and the peace that we can find as a community within ourselves. And for me, that's why, because I'm going based off of that term and that definition of peace, I would say that this program definitely accomplished that, because in so many ways we were working together and we had our goals, right, with our projects, but more than that, it was this connection. Every one of us, our key takeaway was about having conversations, communicating, learning from the other, and really having that relationship building aspect. And I hear that, and I definitely agree with it. And that's where I think the peace really starts. You don't just get peace, you have to work towards it. And that's what I see here. And this is an incredible program towards that end.
Thanks, Kristy. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say it was an invitation to peace building. I don't know if everybody took the invitation and joined in. I had members in my group that in some ways checked out and just tried to check off the boxes and be done with their commitment for the 9 months. They showed up to the meetings, but at the end of the day, did they take on the invitation to really wrestle with what was presented to them? I can't say for sure, but I will say that the invitation was extended to everyone. And it's everyone's choice to decide whether or not they want to accept that invitation and join in.
Go ahead, Michele.
In the simplest way, the more we humanize people with whom we disagree with, the less chance there'll be that we'll move away from peace. Or put it in the flip side, the more we see each other's humanity, the more we will be more inclined to find peace and peaceful solutions. So in that sense, talking, dialoguing, trying to understand each other's point of view better, it can't help but humanize us more to each other, and to whatever even little incremental way that happens, I think that helps us to find peace and peaceful solutions.
All right. Go ahead if you want.
Yeah, thank you for that closing question, Joe. I think this was definitely gave us tools to equip us to begin doing some peace building work. I don't know that peace was necessarily a stated value at the beginning of the program, and so maybe it's a challenge to encourage that to be one of the values that we amplify. I do look at peace as being something holistic, in terms of peace being physically, emotionally, and psychologically finding peace. In terms of that's how we're able to build peace within community. I think it's a communal practice, but also an individual practice. So I think it's something that could be incorporated more intentionally in the program. And I also think that that there's work. It's a journey, right? Like we said it before, and like are we able to include maybe more phases in this program? But I think it's definitely tools that we can build upon that would bring about peace. But I wouldn't say it was a necessarily peace building program.
Well, thanks for sharing those perspectives. And I think it certainly, given the range of perspective you just shared, it does depend in part on our definition. And as you say, Kristy, it's not just the absence of violence, but it's a society that is peaceful and where there is justice for everyone in the country. And whereas, Michele, you say we can humanize each other and see each other as the unique individuals that we all are. So with that, I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, Brian, Michele, Shenée, Kristy. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your experiences and your insights. Thank you to all of our attendees for sticking with us and for giving up your time to listen to some different perspectives. And thank you to the Alliance for Peacebuilding for hosting this session. I'll turn it back over to the Alliance for Peacebuilding for any closing remark.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Joe, and thank you to our panelists. And this is, goodness, I learned so much, and so I'm really appreciative of all of you being here and sharing your experience and your perspective with us. Just to close, I think that next week, June the 9th, on Wednesday, we're actually going to be taking a break from the series, but we are going to be back on June 16th with a pretty fantastic event on elections and everything that needs to happen in terms of how elections happen in our country in order to prevent violence. And then after that, on June 26th, we are looking forward to an event on rebuilding and protecting U.S. democracy. So we hope to see everyone back and have a wonderful rest of your day and take good care. Bye-bye.